Hi everybody, Ann from Super Stitch. In this video I'm going to talk about the buttonhole foot. Now everybody's going to have some different variations of the buttonhole foot, and I'll kind of explain some different options as we go along. Some machines will include what's called a stabilizer plate, so we'll explain what that's for. And we're just going to go over different tips and tricks for how to make a perfect buttonhole for anything from regular cotton fabric to fleece, knits, anything that might maybe give you a problem when you're making your buttonhole. So we're just going to give you some tips on how to achieve a perfect buttonhole. So again, we welcome your suggestions for tips and tricks. Let's go show you what we can do with this one. If you have a machine, I'm working on my M7 today. If you've got a machine with an automatic buttonhole foot, we'll talk about that, but we'll give you tips if you've got other buttonhole feet without all of these features as well. So basically, your automatic buttonhole feet are going to have an opening here in the back. You're just going to open this up, and that's where you're going to place your button. So you're going to open this in the back of the foot, place your button, and then close it down. Now, if you see where you have the L and the S, that's for large and small. So the line in the middle is going to be for a standard size button. So this is a kind of a standard button. If you had a really thick button like this, you might want to open that up a little bit more. See that? That's going to make it just a little bit larger to allow for the depth of the button, and we're going to talk about those adjustments later. If you had a really flat button, or maybe it's going into a very silky, slippery fabric, you might want to close it down and also make it a little bit smaller than normal. So this is your adjustment for the length of the opening of the buttonhole itself. So this is going to be the length of the buttonhole. These are going to be the markings that you're going to align with your fabric. So this is going to line up with the center of where you want your buttonhole to be, and these lines will line up with the beginning, the start point of the buttonhole. So your buttonhole is going to always start at the beginning. So if you mark, let's say this is the center front of your garment, and you mark where you want your buttonholes to be, this is the way it's going to get positioned on your fabric. And if your machine comes with a stabilizer plate, we'll talk about that. This is an option that when you have fabric that doesn't want to feed well, you're going to place your fabric in between the buttonhole foot and the stabilizer plate. So this is what's going to be feeding on your feed dogs rather than your fabric, so that you're going to get nice even feeding. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so if you don't have the automatic buttonhole foot, it is important to allow for the thickness of your button. So this is just sort of a standard button here. But if you had something like this, for example, you would need to measure from the bottom of the button over across the top and down the other side. So this button would require a 1 1/4 inch size buttonhole. So it is important to allow for the thickness of the button, which this would allow for here by opening that up. Now, if you have an oversized button that doesn't fit in here, we'll talk about how you can make any size buttonhole as well. So we'll start with just a standard buttonhole. So again, I'm just going to start by placing my button in the buttonhole foot. I'm going to snap the buttonhole foot on the machine. Now, anytime you have a foot where the thread can't draw right under the foot, so the trick is to place your fabric underneath the foot, do a needle down, needle up, simply draw your fabric away, and now you've drawn the thread underneath the foot. So I'm going to start with a standard buttonhole, but if you've got a machine with different styles of buttonholes, we'll discuss some of those. This is just your standard rectangular buttonhole. We'll discuss the memorized buttonhole when we need a buttonhole that is not automatically set for you. These are rounded. This one's rounded at the bottom, this one's rounded at both ends, and that's going to be for your finer fabrics where the straight bottom might pucker your fabric. So these are going to be for finer fabrics. Then we have several different styles of keyhole buttonholes here, and that would be for a shank button. Then we also have a couple of stretch buttonholes. Now let's say you don't know what this is. If you happen to have the M7, you could open your AccuSpark tool and I could actually just scan this QR code, and that would tell me I've selected the sensor buttonhole. It's going to tell me how to use that. If I wasn't sure what this buttonhole was for, this is now going to tell me that it's a stretch buttonhole. We have another stretch buttonhole here. We have another really nice buttonhole. This is looks like a handwork buttonhole, very nice for your heirloom projects. Then we have this buttonhole here that just simply makes a rectangle, and that would be for making a bound buttonhole. And then we have, this would be to sew on buttons. We'll talk about that later. And then we've got on this machine, we've got a darning stitch, a bar tack, and some tacking and eyelets. But we're going to stay with our buttonholes for now. So I'll start with your standard buttonhole again, and we'll talk about your settings. You may or may not have the slit width as an option. In this first setting here, this allows for me to open the slit width. So again, if I had a thick buttonhole, I could open that slit width up, and that's going to, you can even see how that opening up a little bit for my thicker buttonholes. I'll put that back at default for now. The width is going to be the width across the bottom of the buttonhole. 5 is going to be your standard here. The next one is my density, so that's how close together these stitches will be. And then I have my tension and my foot pressure. So I'm going to leave everything at default for my first example. So again, I've lined up my markings with the beginning where I want my buttonhole to start, and I've lined up the center with the center of the buttonhole. Now it tells me to pull down my buttonhole lever, so I'm going to reach behind. It's very important that you pull this all the way down so it engages. The other thing you want to make sure that you do, you're going to lift this, make sure that you haven't pulled the buttonhole foot forward. Make sure that it's pushed all the way back. Sometimes when you're putting it under there, you might tend to pull it a little bit. So make sure that that is all the way engaged at the beginning. And then I'm simply going to start. So what this is going to do is it's going to do a stay stitch the left side, and then it's going to do my beading all the way down the left side. And now it's stay stitching the right, and it's going to come down. So now both sides of my buttonhole are stitched in the same direction, which gives me a perfect feed balance. And it's going to lock off. And I've now completed a perfect buttonhole. Now the trick to opening your buttonhole is to take a straight pin and insert it through the top of the buttonhole. Then insert your seam ripper at the bottom and then cut it open. That way I can't, by mistake, run through the top of my buttonhole. So that's just our standard buttonhole here. So we'll talk about how you can make some adjustments to that depending on your fabric. So let's say we had a thicker buttonhole. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to make some adjustments. So I'll go ahead and I'll open up that slit width, and maybe I want it to be a little bit wider because I've got a big heavy button in here. I'll make a bigger buttonhole. But maybe I don't really need it quite so dense, so I'm going to increase my stitch length. Then the stitches won't be quite so close together. So I've made some adjustments there. And now I'll put my bigger button in. And now I've put the bigger button in, and I'm going to open that up a little bit to make it a little bit longer, and I've made it a little bit wider to accommodate my fatter button. So again, it's going to stay stitched the left side. My stitches aren't quite so dense. And as you can see, so it's not quite as heavy a buttonhole, but I have a much wider opening here to accommodate my fatter button. So let's talk about the next one over is my memorized buttonhole. So you'll notice here, now it doesn't tell me to pull down my buttonhole lever. it says to open the buttonhole foot itself. So if I had an oversized button like this, now I've measured it, I needed a 1 3/4 inch buttonhole. So I've actually measured that and I drew my ending point on my fabric. Or again, if I were reworking a buttonhole, I'm just gonna sew to that point. So I'm gonna use this foot, and I have a little channel right down the middle that I'm going to run down the center of the buttonhole. So again, I'm going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to sew till I get to that mark. When I get to that mark, if you look on the sewing machine, it says to sew to that length and then press the reverse key. So I've set that first side, and now I'm going to press my reverse key. And that's going to advance it to the next step. So now it's going to sew, it's going to do my stay stitch down to the other end. I'm going to sew to the bottom. And again, I'm going to press my reverse key, and that's going to advance it to the next step. And when I get to that step, I'm going to press my reverse key again, and that's going to complete it. So you're telling the machine each step to advance. So I've now completed one whole buttonhole. Then if I wanted to make another one the same size, I would just simply start sewing again, and it would have memorized that buttonhole length, and it will complete that. So in that example, you are advancing to each step by pressing the reverse key. Any of the machines that would have a memorized, if it says memorized buttonhole, that's the way it's going to work. So if you don't have the memorized buttonhole, but you do have like a 4-step buttonholer, basically you're going to do the same thing, except sometimes there's machines that'll have where you're gonna dial from 1 step to 2 step to 3 to 4. So you're kind of doing the same thing. But if you have a memorized buttonhole, if you press reverse at each step, it will then memorize that, and you could just continue making the same buttonhole. Again, I have so many different styles of buttonholes on here, and if you've got a lot of styles, you might want to just practice with them and see what you have. I am going to do one of my favorites here, which is the Heirloom style buttonhole. So I'm just going to do that one to show you how that looks. And I'm going to go back to my regular foot. Again, I'll just do a needle down, needle up, draw the fabric away. Now, when you're making buttonholes, again, I've just got some tearaway stabilizer on the back here. You're going to have stabilizer, or if you're garment sewing, you should have interfacing in there as well. So it is important that you have interfacing or a stabilizer. Notice I forgot to pull down my buttonhole lever, so the machine actually stopped to remind me to pull down the buttonhole lever. Isn't that a pretty buttonhole? It's just a very delicate looking buttonhole, very nice for your heirloom garments. So now we'll talk about your stabilizer plate and working with some difficult fabrics. So this is a fleece, and it's very stretchy, and it can get kind of, maybe it doesn't feed that well where it wants to get stuck. So if you have a fabric that is kind of not feeding well for you, or it's getting too stretchy, maybe it's uneven and you're really struggling to get that buttonhole to form correctly, that's where I'm going to use my stabilizer plate. So I'm going to insert that into the buttonhole foot itself. And now my fabric is going to go in between. So now, as I form my buttonhole, this is feeding on the feed dogs rather than my fabric. So if you have a difficult fabric to work with, use your stabilizer plate if you have it. If not, you're going to need to put a tearaway stabilizer or something on the back to help feed that. Now, if it's a plush fabric like this, you'll also want to use a water-soluble topping. So I'm just going to place a piece of water-soluble topping underneath so that it's on top of my fabric. That's going to keep my stitches so that they're going to form nicely on the top. So I've got my water-soluble topping, I've got my stretchy fabric, and I have my stabilizer plate on the bottom. And because this is stretchy, I'm going to choose a stretch buttonhole. So number 10 on the M7 is the stretch buttonhole. And again, my AccuSpark app gives me more information about that. So again, I'll do a needle down, needle up, and just kind of draw this away a little bit to get that thread under the foot. I'm going to pull down my buttonhole lever. So you'll notice, because it's a stretch buttonhole, the fabric is kind of feeding back and forth to give me that stretch. So I can just tear my stabilizer away, and so now I've created a stretchy buttonhole that formed nicely on the back without having the problem of getting stuck. The next trick I want to show is using a corded buttonhole. So especially in something stretchy, adding a cord is going to add a little bit extra strength to your buttonhole. So I've just got just a simple cord here. It's just a gimp. You could use pearl crown rayon, any type of a small cord here. So if you were using this type of a foot, you're simply going to wrap it around the back and then draw it towards you, and you're stitching right over the cord. So I'm going to fold the cord in half. I'm going to bring it around here, draw it right under these grooves in the back, and then hold it into here. So you can see how that cord is now right underneath the foot, and the buttonhole is going to sew right over top of it. I'll just do a standard buttonhole for this one just so you can see how the cord is going to work. So you see, as it sews the beading stitch, it's stitching right over top the cord. So then you're simply going to pull on one end of the cord, and it pulls that loop down into the buttonhole, and you can just cut this off. So you can see, maybe you can tell the difference. This has a lot more strength to it than the regular buttonhole. So if you need to add a little bit more strength to your buttonhole, just put an extra cord in there and it will stitch right over it while you're sewing. So once I've made all my buttonholes and I want to just sew the buttons on with my machine, so I can do that. And what I do is I like to just place my buttons where I need them to be, and I just Scotch tape them in place. So I just tape my buttons down, and then I can just go right down my garment sewing them on. So I'll talk about the button sewing foot, and this is to allow you, you may or may not have one of these, this is to allow you to give that button the extra lift if it is that thick button or if it needs to go through some thick fabric. So we'll talk about both. Now it's very important, if you have a foot that has the 2 bars, the shorter feet will have that. Your gathering foot, your button sewing foot, some of your other feet have 2 bars. So it's very important that the back bar goes on the back of the ankle and then snaps on. There's a little notch in the back of the ankle, so that back bar needs to snap onto the back of the ankle and then snap on. So I could just go to number 14 here, and that's to sew on just a regular buttonhole or button, and it tells me to use my T-foot. This has automatically dropped my feed dogs. Or I could go to my sewing applications page, and I could select button here, and then this is going to tell me a regular buttonhole or the shank buttonhole. So we'll do a regular buttonhole first. If you don't have the button sewing feature, basically what you need is a zigzag. The standard width between the holes is 3.5. So you're just gonna select a zigzag and drop your feed dogs. So we'll talk about how to adjust that. So make sure your feed dogs are down. So the way the sewing buttonhole first, or the button sewing stitch works, you're going to align your needle with the left hole of the button. Then I turn my hand wheel 1 revolution toward me, and the needle is going to jump over. I'm going to double check if that drops in there. So that's pretty close, but it could come over just a little bit. So I'm going to increase my stitch width, and you'll see the needle move over. So now it's over just a little bit further. So that first swing is to adjust your width if needed. So once I know that my left and right swing are lining up with the holes, then I simply just sew, and it's going to do several zigzags, and then it's going to lock off. And then I can just simply move to my next buttonhole, or my next button. So now this one I will use the shank. So I'm going to select the shank here, and this is going to give you how much lift you need. So I'll just slide this underneath my button, and that's going to just give it that extra lift so it will go through my thicker fabrics. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to line up that left hole. I'm using the hand wheel to manually drop that needle, and then it swings over to the right, and I can see I need to move that over just a little bit. So I'm going to move my needle over. 1 more. So I'm just making sure my left and right needle swings line up. It's going to lock off. Notice, even though I have my automatic thread cutter turned on, it is not cutting my thread. I don't want to cut the thread yet. And sometimes I'll just add another set to make it even more secure. So then I will pull off a thread tail. You can see the difference. This button is sewn pretty secure right onto the fabric, but this one has a little bit of a lift to it. So I can take my thread tails and pull them through. This one I can just cut off. It's been locked off, so I can just cut that off. This one I'm going to pull my thread tails through. I'll pull my bobbin thread and my top thread through, and I'm going to wrap that thread shank that was created, and then I can tie that off, and that's going to give me a really, really secure button to sew, to be able to go through my thicker fabrics. So hopefully that gives you some tips and tricks for making buttonholes and sewing on buttons, and maybe give you a little bit better understanding. If you have any questions about making buttonholes, just put it in the comments below. We'll see if we can help you out. And make sure you subscribe so that you'll get all of our other tips and tricks.